Welcome to the Convergence Podcast. I'm your host, Ashok Shivanan.
Silence may be comfortable in the moment, but silence is expensive. The avoidance that we have for these hard conversations leads to things like the loss of credibility, loss of trust, loss of safety.
On this show, we'll deconstruct the best practices, principles, and the underlying philosophies behind the most engaged product teams who ship the most successful products. This is what teams are made of. We've all been in those uncomfortable meetings when the tension's real, the stakes are high, and yet we somehow collectively fumble the conversation, or worse, we avoid it entirely. Welcome back to Convergence FM, folks. Our guest today is Joshua Graves. Joshua is the founder and a designer at Lost Horse Labs, and he's also the author of the book, We Need to Talk, a book 10 years in the making that tackles, in my opinion, one of the hardest parts of leadership, real, honest, human conversation, especially when it gets uncomfortable. I personally love that each chapter in the book comes with real stories from product teams in the field, the hard conversations they needed to have, and the sometimes counterintuitive outcomes that they ultimately led to. Joshua has shaped products and teams across government, green tech, and consumer startups. He's led design at firms like Pivotal Labs, Azebo, and Cardinal, and contributed to products ranging from EV charging apps to Major League Baseball's digital marketplace. He's coached leaders, rebuilt design teams, and created rituals that foster psychological safety and trust that lead to innovation at a pace that's both fast as well as sustainable. On the episode, we talk about what happens when leaders don't address conflict, why rituals can create predictable environments amidst the chaos that comes with innovation, and how to build teams that aren't just efficient and effective, but also resilient. Here is my conversation with Joshua Graves. Subscribe to the podcast to get future episodes as soon as they're published. If you find this helpful, give the podcast a 5-star rating on your podcast app or hit that like button on YouTube. Thank you so much for making time to join us. I've been excited to chat with you further about Lost Horse as well as the book. There are a number of books out there on leadership and communication already. And it sounds like you've been working on this for over 10 years, or the seeds were planted 10 years ago. I'm curious kind of what gap you were looking to fill or what kind of problem you were looking to solve by writing your own book.
One of the ways that I learn is through experimentation. And I can read someone's book about how to do this, how to do that. And I will collect tools. I will collect things that work for me, for my situation, and then I'll use them. And so part of this is solving a problem that I had, where the way that I grew up is I grew up in the South. We're all very nice people. Your responses to conflict were essentially yes, ma'am, or yes, sir. Or if you wanted to do what kids did on the playground, you could go punch someone, but we don't do that as adults. So my frame of reference was functionally a blank slate. So I got to steer clear of things that, would engender bad habits or things like that. And I think this book has been really influential for me and other folks on how to approach things in ways that are authentic to them. And so the biggest gap that I'm seeing with my book versus other books is a lot of the books will tell you a prescriptive framework. Do this, you'll get that outcome. Try this, you'll get this other outcome. Real conversations don't work that way because we're full of way too many variables. The walks of life we come from, the lens with which we see things, it's all different. And there can't be a one-size-fits-all solution for this. So this book is a non-prescriptive framework which accounts for all of the different variants that you might encounter in a hard conversation. And it took so long partly because I had to get outside of my own head for writing this book to see how other people approach conflict, how folks who are in different cultures approach conflict. And there's a whole lot of sitting and listening and exploring that this book shows you how to do in ways that are tactical. And you can get to the bottom of something a lot easier with folks. Similarly, I've seen a couple of other books around sort of being able to be like this puppet master style person who can manipulate people and just win conversations. That's sort of the empire version of my book. And I wrote the Jedi version of it. So we're trying to use all of our powers for good for the mutual benefit of everyone, not to win or cajole or get your way.
I love it. So we're looking for sort of long-term collaborative interests. There's a lot of experimentation that went into it. And I certainly noticed that there was more of a compass versus a map approach where you were taking, not giving folks like hyper prescriptive scripts, but more an understanding and a set of tools that can be deployed in a variety of ways. And I could say I didn't grow up in the South, but my family dynamic was somewhat similar where we avoided conflict at all costs. And I've realized later on that avoiding conflict has like a much higher cost oftentimes in the long term, certainly, sometimes even in the short term. In the workplace, I've, didn't speak up on things. It held myself back from progress and ultimately held the organization back from progress, where we arrived at something much later because I didn't speak up when I could have. And that's something I've had to overcome. And I'm curious if you've have a sense of like the cost of not having the hard conversation, or if you've formed a framework around that.
Oh boy. Yeah, I'm really glad you asked that. I wanted to respond really briefly to something you said about a compass versus a map. And that is entirely the vibe for my book. It aligns with my philosophy on designing software and just generally approaching life. Like, I don't want to give someone a map. I'll give someone some guideposts, but they need to follow the compass. It's a little like orienteering, this sport where you're essentially just like dropped in the middle of the woods and you're trying to find your way out. And sometimes all you have is just a pencil, paper, and a compass. And you can be dropped into the same woods 100 different times, but you'll be in different spots and you'll be with different people.
Mm-hmm.
You'll have different constraints. So the compass, these guideposts are the way around. Okay, you also asked me about this other thing around conflict avoidance. Is that right?
Yeah, I'd say there is a, in the short term, I think avoiding the conflict feels like there's some benefit or perceived benefit to it. And then upon reflection for me, I think there's a lot of loss or cost that has come as a result to myself, the people around me, whether it's at work or personal, in the near and long terms that are sort of hidden. And I'm curious if that's something you've had a chance to think through maybe more than I have, and any opinions you have.
Yeah. Well, for one, silence may be comfortable in the moment, but silence is expensive. And the avoidance that we have for these hard conversations leads to things like the loss of credibility, loss of trust, loss of safety. You could lose funding for your project. It could go on and on. And this isn't to say you need to have every single conversation, because that's not productive and that's not a good way to spend your life or your energy. There's something in the book around how you might want to approach a conversation, or if you want to approach a conversation. And it's a little flowchart that I put together that just asks you questions like, what are your motivations? How are you feeling? Is this going to resolve itself? If you don't talk about this, what might happen? And if the worst happens, how long is it going to take you to recover? And I find that these more contemplative measures can be really helpful, because oftentimes you do, when you are avoiding a conversation, have time to think about it. You have time to process it. And you can sit with your feelings. You can sit with your thoughts. You can sit with the impact of what's happening And you can have a much more informed path forward when you really check in with yourself and think about like, hey, what is really going on here? How am I seeing it? What stories am I telling myself? What are the actual facts of this situation? And this can help you have a really clear head around A, whether you want to have this conversation or not, B, if you want to frame it differently, because you may find once you sit with it that what you thought was on the surface might not be. And one of the common ways that I think about this is this old maxim of Hanlon's razor, and it's had several different permutations, but the gist of it is don't attribute to malice what you can attribute to ignorance or oversight. And that's not to say that everyone should always assume positive intent, because I think that gets into this culture and idea of toxic positivity. Sometimes you don't want to assume positive intent because people have demonstrated that they have lost that privilege. But if you can sit with it and you can try and ask yourself, like, okay, are they not seeing the whole thing? Am I not seeing the whole thing? What might be holding them up? And you can get through to the bottom of the situation together a lot more easier if that's the case.
And I think a lot of this is starting to get rooted in neuroscience and psychology that has been available to us for decades, in only starting to kind of become to the surface in the mass market in the recent years. And so what are some parts that are worthwhile kind of mentioning in terms of how our brains get in the way and how our brains react?
I love to get into the electronics that I have and try and repair them and understand them. And I do similarly with myself, think about my constraints. I think about how I tend to approach situations. And once you understand how things are built and the constraints you're dealing with, working through conflict or anything else is a lot easier because you know where the bounds of this are, you know where the edges are. When technology changed, like iPhones came out and they were not very repairable at all. And they functionally became like a little black box. And so it's like, you don't really know what's going on in there. A lot of neuroscience, a lot of things that I've learned about psychology have really helped inform like what is in this little black box. And there is one in our brains, and it's called the amygdala, and it sits between our eyes and our brain. And it's essentially your body's smoke detector. And so you're trying to understand that this thing is there, that it works mostly independently. How do you work with that? And so there was a good deal of research that I did around hacking, around the amygdala, sort of rewiring and retuning things so that you add in things that give a little more air and oxygen to your brain when you're faced with something that's hard. So you can try things like slowing it down, speaking a little slower, taking a breath. And that gives your brain a little more oxygen, a little more time to process. And you also just want to integrate more of a more daily introspective process. Like this book is scoped around how to do things at work with other humans, but it applies in your personal life. And so much of it is around nonviolent communication, sitting, looking, observing, trying to be more of a detached observer from things to the extent with which you're able. And so the more that you can integrate these ideas of sitting with it, asking some clarifying questions, and not believing the stories that you tell yourself immediately. It's not to say that you don't want to trust your gut, but our brains really don't enjoy doing a lot of labor. They want to save all of those calories. They want to save a lot of energy. And so that's where things like heuristics come in. That's where things like stereotypes come in, because they're familiar crutches, familiar footholds for us, and they can just become the defaults. And so these questions, this checking in with yourself, this looking, this listening is a really good way of getting around that.
Fostering an engaged product organization and aligning them with the principles around lean, human-centered design, and agile will more than likely lead to successful business outcomes for your organization. But getting started or getting unblocked can be hard. This podcast is brought to you by the player coaches over at Integral. They help ambitious companies like you build amazing product teams and ship products in artificial intelligence, cloud, web, and mobile. Listeners to the podcast can head on over to integral.io/convergence and get a free product success lab. During this session, the Integral team will facilitate a problem-solving exercise that gives you clarity and confidence to solve a product design or engineering problem. That's integral.io/convergence. Now, back to the show.
A lot of the folks listening are founders, CEOs, product leaders, and are in kind of similar kind of situations trying to solve pretty complex tech problems, lead organizations, and the messiness that comes with the people. And starting with ourselves, what are some things you think that we can do to notice those moments in ourselves?
Well, so there's always this concept that's helpful of just checking in with yourself. And it falls under the umbrella of mindfulness, which I think can probably get a little overcomplicated. Everyone has a lot of trappings and things like that they'd like to sell you alongside mindfulness. But you really don't have to invest in anything. You don't have to sit and meditate all the time. You can just be present with yourself. Think about what's going on in your body. Did you sleep well? Have you eaten? Have you had any water? And it sounds silly, but if you can integrate a practice, like start doing this in small stakes, like small stakes situations, and you'll be surprised at when something really stressful comes up, how you're able to know what's going on in your body, how it might shape your reactions. And to be clear, it won't always be successful. You still get caught up by your emotions, your feelings, your thoughts, what's going on in front of you, because that amygdala still works the way that it does. So you will, if you have this practice of sitting and listening, be able to confront something that's really complex and figure out a way forward. Like if you're a CEO or you're someone who's dealing with a really, really, really wildly complex problem space, there's a lot of deep thinking and a lot of thought you need to do for how to resolve something. And there's a deep appreciation for there being so many moving parts to managing an operation, having a vision for this operation, this product, these people, this team. And you can sit back and think about, like, what is the overall strategy? Am I getting too much in the weeds? And I think I've seen that with a lot of founders, because a lot of them came up from the trenches. A lot of them had to hack it together. They had to be the people who were looking at the code. They had to understand it. And it's really easy when things get complex, when things get stressful, to fall back on what we know and what we used to do. And there's definitely something to be said for a leader who is involved in details. But I think we maybe take that a little too far sometimes, like with a famous example would be Steve Jobs. And I don't think that was good design leadership. I don't think that was good product leadership, to be so much of a dictator. And I think if you can sit back and think about the strategy, the vision, the high level stuff, lean on your team to figure out the details. You set the vision, you set the guideposts, you let your team chart the trail. And that's probably the best way that I've got to describe how you can approach these complex problems and how you can check in with yourself.
And I love that you're getting into leaders starting with themselves and then transitioning to creating an environment. And I think in your research, you've come up with a number of stories where that environment of psychological safety was created. It ended up leading to much better outcomes for the organization, the leaders ultimately, because they invested and did the hard parts of creating that environment. And I'd love for you to share some of that.
Yeah. Well, it's very much like you are creating an ecosystem. Like the team that you work with, the company that you create is an ecosystem. The products you create are also an ecosystem. And so it's sort of like, was it something related to Stephen King where someone just said like it's turtles all the way down? I don't know if you've ever heard that, but
I haven't.
it's like just this infinite fractal experience of like ecosystems built upon ecosystems ad infinitum. Once you understand that you're creating an environment, you are defining what can and can't thrive in it. Just like you can't grow, you can't grow every crop in every season. Every season needs something different. And you, as a leader, someone who's creating this environment, you are going to be able to define what you want to grow. And safety, psychological safety, openness, candor, transparency, all of those things need to come from the top. They need to come from you as a leader. They need to come from your team, because if your team doesn't feel safe to say, oh, I think this is a mistake, we've got some data that's showing otherwise, or even if you don't have data, if you have like a really big hunch, if you have some expertise, you should be able to talk about that with your leaders. And if it's not safe to do so, you're not going to get and leverage what you're paying for your team, and you're not going to be able to let people live up to their full potential in your organization. So we've got someone who's Lisa in the book. They worked at a place where it was really, really tough to exist. Like people crying in the bathrooms between meetings. And it was something that they heard multiple times. It was just a hard place to work. Other places, the one place specifically that they went to was able to change a lot of those dynamics to make it easier to work with other humans because they spent time ritualizing, humanizing other people. And what I mean by that is they had things like user manuals. And so you get to go and ask like, hey, how do you communicate? What is it that motivates you? How do you like to give and receive feedback? What do you find demotivating? What do you do outside of work as a human? And this is something that as a leader, every person who reported to me, I had a version of this conversation with them because like I want to understand their frame of reference. Some of them did not want to ever be mentioned in public. They didn't want to be praised in public. They needed more time to think about things. And I'm going into some detail about this specifically because we have to realize that everyone sees the world differently and interacts with the world differently. They have different mental models for things. And what these processes do, these user manuals, these other things that we can talk about in a moment, is they help you get a frame of reference for this specific person so that you can have the most rewarding, the most fruitful relationship, the most fruitful product sprint, the most important launch you've had. And I remember talking with them and I asked them about this old thing that we used to do back in the days when I worked at Pivotal. And it was just a really simple exercise that you did with one person or your team. And it was just called plus deltas. And so you want to identify something that you thought went well. And it's important for these things that you are actionable, specific, and kind. So not just saying, hey, this looks great. I really liked this. But going into more detail and saying, I think that the way that you optimized this function saved a lot of processing power in the code base. I don't know. I probably shouldn't give an engineer example because I'm not an engineer. I can just give another example for designers. Like, oh, the way that you engineered this flow, it is something that's going to reduce drop off by 30%. And that's huge. And with the deltas, you want to talk about things that could be going differently or better. And then it's also important here to keep in mind that you don't want that to be something about the person, because things go wrong when you either make it personal or you take it personal. And so think about framing it in terms of the project. You can use this idea of something that's around the situation, the behavior, the impact, and realize that what you're saying is in service to what you're doing together. And it's not a value judgment. It's not an evaluation of the other person.
Yeah, having gotten to work at Pivotal myself, I had certainly gotten to experience the power of ritual. It was the first place that there was sort of a discipline in a structure while also enabling so much innovation. I came in with the notion that those things were very counterintuitive, and gotten to see the structure and discipline can actually unlock a ton of change and transformation and innovation. And we brought a lot of them to Integral, and thankfully they stuck. It was kind of hard for me to feel like, despite being a founder, I deserved in some capacity to create rituals, and felt like that was more for the divine to do, versus for someone who was running a software company. And so I'm curious about your opinion on rituals there. And I know that it also is really helpful for fostering that psychological safety. I'm curious if there's anything you've thought about there that you can tie in as well.
There is something to rituals and their value. And sure, there is something, there's a certain religious aspect to it. And I'm actually not going to shy away from that. I'm going to lean into it. Mm-hmm. What I mean by that is these rituals are intended to provide meaning, familiarity, and opportunities for reflection and growth. And I think that they're healthy. To extend on this idea of it being from, religious informed, we could say, is you also don't want it to become dogmatic. You don't want it to become rote. You don't want it to become meaningless or perfunctory. And I think part of the reason that rituals can be successful is they're meaningfully and intentionally adopted. So sure, everyone says, yeah, I would like to get some feedback about how this project went or how this week went. But when things are moving really fast, that kind of stuff goes in the back burner and it kind of piles up. So it's like tech debt in a way. And so if you don't clear this debt, if you don't address things that, like, take retrospectives, for example, having a regimented time where you can do this, it's set aside for the whole team. It can be an area which can foster continuous improvement. And that's really what I recall it being all about. But moreover, it maps very personally with how I'm aligned with work and life. Like, I want continuous improvement. It's something to keep in mind that you don't want to over ritualize things, because that is something that becomes too much process, and you want just enough process. Too much and it becomes brittle. Too much and it becomes a shackle. And that's something that we want to make sure that we stay away from. And I think a way to make them meaningful is A, as a leader, not to just prescribe that you do these things, but B, participate in them, continue to foster and set up that environment where it is safe. It is okay to say, I don't feel like this went very well. Here's an area I think that we could optimize. Here's a risk I'm seeing. And if the team is able to see that, you can sort of graft that into the team culture, but also let them have their own spin on it. Let them adapt it, because co-creation is the way to have a really meaningful, effective outcome.
I think that's really clarifying. And, in my case, as I look back, I feel like when it comes to the rituals and dogma, a self-check for me was if I was doing it to foster a more predictable environment for the team, that was sort of the ideal state where everyone kind of had like some structure and discipline and predictability of what they were coming in and how we were going to work so that we can go tackle the uncertain a lot better. On the other hand, like I'll just concede, there were times that I was doing it for control, where it gave me a personal sense of uncertainty or certainty amongst the uncertainty because we had this like kind of dogmatic system in place, which is, looking back and maybe to some extent at the time I knew, okay, this is actually not in service of what these rituals can be beneficial. As a leader, one of the most important things you're going to do is take on more uncertainty for the team so you can make it more predictable for folks to work together. And that your take there is quite clarifying as well for me. And in similar vein, I think there's also, in order to create a high trust environment amongst your teammates, having them resolve things along a common set of tools and rituals is one thing, but it doesn't answer all the questions. Sometimes you have to kind of get involved and play at the team level in order to be the team leader. And I think you've got some research and experience on that as well, right?
So the setup for this is a startup that is launching something that allows fans to have access to Major League Baseball players prior to the playoffs. It's a big deal for them. It's a lot of funding at stake. There's a lot of runway at stake. And then there was something that came up between the product folks and the engineering folks, and it caused them to miss their launch window. And so there was a loss of revenue, loss of runway. It stung for everyone. And people had a lot invested in it. And so naturally that led to things like the blame game and being standoffish and not really working it out amongst themselves. And so you're trying to figure out as a leader how you're going to jump into this, when you need to jump into this. So we could talk a little about how to do mediation. First, let's talk about when to do it. You don't want to get involved in this if you don't have to, because you, as the person who is at the helm, who's leading this, it is going to be very, very difficult for everyone else to be neutral, be objective, because in so many ways, this is also your show in addition to theirs. So when you do go and mediate with folks, it's really important that you set the tone. So set some ground rules. So time box it, that you don't do personal attacks, that you don't ask questions that start with why. You start with what and how. And I mention that because the more you talk about why, the more you invite defensive triggers. And so asking questions that are what and how based, keep that logical part of your brain engaged, gives a little more oxygen, gives a little more blood, and it can help you be a little bit more objective. Why gets a lot of emotions and judgment and validation wrapped up in it that does not serve anyone in a situation like this. It's also important that you do this in a place where it's private. So you don't want to be interrupted. You don't want this to be a thing that's broadcast publicly. When you are mediating, like try to speak and get people to speak to the situation, the behavior, the impact, because it's already clear that things have gone on, have escalated. Maybe people tried to work it out before they talked to you. But because you're at your strategic position as a leader, you don't see everything that happens on the day-to-day. And so your job is to try and get to the bottom of it. And so asking these probing questions that are about the situation, the behavior, the impact, that's how you can all arrive at this like shared pool of meaning that you contribute to. And it's going to help you decide what you want to do going forward. And depending on how folks act in these sessions can also inform what you want to do. And to go deeper on that, I mean that it's okay to have emotions. It's okay to get a little hot sometimes, but we have to be mindful and aware that we're responsible for our emotions and it's not on someone else to work through. But nothing in this conversation should be taken as like you shouldn't have emotions, but it's like dealing with them in a productive way. Maybe you do take a second, take a breather, come back in 5. But at the end of the day, you have to make this call about what you want to do. And there may be incredibly valid reasons on both sides for what you need to do to mitigate and remediate and move forward. But you're going to have to get agreement and alignment on disagreeing and committing, because you can't always have it the perfect way all the time. And that's an unfortunate, but also I think really freeing reality once you think about it, because there's so much pressure to do everything perfectly. You know, you've got limited runway, you've got limited time, you have limited resources, limited sanity. And once you realize that like you can't do it perfectly all the time, you can just do the best you can with the information you have on hand, your skills at the time. There's a lot of peace that comes with that. And I hope that if there's any leaders that are listening to this, that's like one thing that they can take away from this. It's that you can't do it perfectly. Get a disagree and commit. Keep going. Keep talking. Keep shipping.
You mentioned earlier about assuming positive intent, and there's also like scenarios in which that necessarily doesn't come into play, especially where folks have, whether it's your teammates, your customers, folks in your community are showing sort of a past history where maybe they no longer have that privilege. This could be folks being lacking integrity, lying, manipulating for their own personal benefit, but not necessarily something that's going to benefit everybody in this equation in the long run. And I'm curious if you've got like thoughts or anything that you've come across around things like accountability there.
I call this chapter in the book the gas mask chapter, and it's how to deal with folks who are lying and gaslighting. And it's helpful to assume that folks don't actively mean harm, but sometimes they lose that privilege depending on what they do or how severe something is. And I'm sure that we've all heard the term gaslighting before, but I also enjoy a little bit of cinema history. All the characters in the book are named after characters in favorite horror films
Oh,
for
cool.
me. But gaslighting came around in like the late 1930s, early 40s, and it became a movie by Ingrid Bergman. And it's where the character is convincing his wife that she's mentally ill, and it's so he can benefit and like take all her money and jewelry and stuff like that. Gorgeous film. But so we found this term making its way into our day-to-day at work. So when we're dealing with this kind of thing at work, we really want to try and figure out how we can really survive, because like this is where like there's a gas leak in the room, and like we really have to figure out how to get around it and how to deal with it and how to shut it off. And sometimes you do have to deal with someone who is changing and rewriting reality. And in this chapter in the book, someone has to have a surprise meeting with HR. And what unfolds in that conversation is a complete fabrication. And it sets, it's something that would set anyone into a tailspin. So you're trying to figure out how do you navigate this? And I generally want to start with this idea of like, if someone is doing something like this, let's still not reduce them to a label like you're a liar, you're an idiot, you're worse, because everyone is still human. Let's keep it human, but still be very clear about what this person did and the impact that they're having here. And some folks tend to bend the truth a little, but everything is on a spectrum here. And so if you're going from like absolute truth, there's a lot of steps in between that and gaslighting. There's like miscommunication, there's omissions, there's lies, and trying to understand where some of that comes from is sometimes helpful, but I tend to avoid going too deep into that when these situations are present, because like if you don't deal with this, it's like becoming more like existential. And so the time for philosophy and why is past. And so sometimes this can mean that you call this person's bluff. You might want to come in with receipts. Like, I know there are a ton of different hacks for this. Like some folks BCC themselves on every email that they send. So if they do have to come in with a receipt, they've got it. And if you can change the format with which you're interacting with these people, so maybe you don't have one-on-one conversations with them. Maybe you do share recaps. Maybe you do make things a little more public. And in the case of the person who's in this chapter in the book, there are ways of documenting the things that they're doing, like what they're working on, what they feel good about, what they need feedback on. And it's getting things into the light and out of the dark, where truth is the only thing that's really going to survive. But you do have folks who can be a little bit more on the malignant side. And I try not to go there by default, but again, if we're being pragmatic and realistic, this does happen. And I go into what you can talk about with someone who is doing this. So sometimes they deflect, or sometimes they try to dismantle every single argument that you have. Like, why don't you just give me one clear example of this? Or maybe it can be easily explained. You're overreacting. And there's some things you can say to this, like, I don't imagine facts. A lot of times we do experience things like what we call now tone policing. And it's when people just argue it's a form over substance argument. And this one's a pretty easy one to spot, but you can just say like, hey, my approach is not really what's at issue here. Like, this is what we need to focus on. And there's so many other things that could happen when you're dealing with this, but really what you need to do is just stay grounded and check in with a friend, check in with yourself, like we talked about at the beginning of our conversation. Like, does what this person is saying sound like something I would do or say? Does it sound like my character? Or might they be projecting something onto me? And that can kind of help you find your way through this. And so I'll close by saying that, folks who are lying and gaslighting, they tend to rely more on your limited store of willpower. And so if you can distribute that, outsource that, put it in terms that are very clear and unambiguous, it's really difficult for someone to continue and double down on those things.
Yeah, I think that's really helpful advice, and hopefully not too often, but inevitably we do come across folks that might fall into some of those categories. Joshua, there's a few questions that I like to ask all my guests, since the podcast is largely around helping foster engaged teams who build delightful products. I'm curious if there's a team that you find particularly inspiring when you're in leadership mode. There's kind of an archetype that you're trying to sort of lead that team towards. This could be a fictional team, a real team, a team that you've been on yourself, or a team that you've kind of heard about through a different way. Anything that comes to mind?
As a kid, I had a lot of allergies. It was hard to go outside, so I played a lot of video games. And some of my favorite ones were where you could just go exploring. But when I think about like teams, something that I always come back to is this like Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It's campy, it's ridiculous, but all the characters, they had their own unique skills. They understood who they were, who the other people were, how they could rely on them. And obviously fun antics happened, but they were a really solid team that could be in a world that is foreign to them, find their way through successfully through encountering a lot of obstacles.
This kind of probably reveals we might be around the same age, and it's around the same time that the TMNT came around, and we'd run around with different sticks and other things, pretending to have be the different turtles, and somehow like it was my two brothers and then my two cousins, and we kind of like all kind of assumed a role, and no one argued over wanting to be Leonardo or anything like that as the leader. Like we all kind of just resonated to one of the characters. And weirdly, like, it was Michelangelo for me because he was kind of like the goofy, chill, pizza loving dude. And growing up, I kind of started to find myself just really obsessed with the artist Michelangelo and the level of obsession that he put into understanding human anatomy, to a point where he would like dig up maybe he didn't dig up graves, but he snuck into the morgue for sure. And he would take cadavers and study them as a way to really build like more anatomically accurate sculpture. And then, from an agile lean standpoint, another thing that I found he did was when he was like making things like the David, was he would leave himself room at the back of the sculpture for whenever a mistake was made. And he would remake the entire front without the mistake, but giving himself that room at the back also gave him some room for error and room for more creativity. And it's something that I haven't really talked to anyone about and it hasn't come up. We haven't talked about Ninja Turtles in a while. So that's awesome. I love that choice.
I was actually going to ask you, when I saw the recognition on your face, what was your favorite character and why was it Michelangelo? And then you just went into this entire explanation of why he was fun. And I had no idea that Da Vinci was probably one of the original goths. Like, who goes around and digs up corpses? Like that's some deep, wild research right there.
Yeah, for sure. Oh, I mean, Michelangelo and Da Vinci are different, but yes, that.
Oh my God, I'm
totally.
Sorry. Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And I mean, the story is fascinating. He put a lot of his like personal wealth at risk, and I think lied to his father that he was getting prepaid for a sculpture when he wasn't. And then at night he would basically like night school himself at a morgue. And that's hilarious that there's some kind of Michelangelo vibes that I was giving off to. But the other question that I love to ask the guests, since this show is about products, is like a recent product or service that you unboxed or experienced that just totally blew your socks off, delighted you?
So I'm always tinkering with something. So whether it is art or server architecture, I have a lot of interest. But the things that have blown me away have been these maker tools that I've been getting. So is on the side, I've learned about screen printing. And so the most recent thing that I unboxed was this thing called an X tool. That's a screen printing kit. And I have a Glowforge that I work with. And so I got to like combine these two different tools to burn a screen and design something myself and screen print it. And just like the joy that I felt with unboxing this like screen printing tool led to this like huge dopamine rush of, oh, I can make these things now. And it's just like, as I opened the box, more ideas came to me, and I would see that, they had like little samples of like inks and fabrics that you could print on. And so it was just like showing me what I can do and giving me a few tools to do it was incredibly exciting for me. And Yeah, I've had a lot of fun screen printing things and made a few shirts, made a few posters, and it's just been an incredibly rewarding experience.
For folks who are curious to follow up this conversation or get in touch with the Lost Horse team, what's the best way?
Sure. So if you want to find me, I'm on LinkedIn, and it's Joshua Graves. And if you want to get in touch with Lost Horse, it's losthorse.design. Send us an email, hello@losthorse.design. We'd love to chat with you. If you want to talk to me about doing speaking, coaching for hard conversations or anything like that, joshuagraves.me. That's my website. Send me an email.
Awesome. We will make sure to have this all in the show notes. Thank you so much for making the time. This was super insightful.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. This was so much fun. I'm really glad we finally got to do this.
I hope you enjoyed that conversation with Joshua Graves. For those of us navigating the messiness of building products while also leading people and keeping the lights on in your budgets and your business, I imagine you would have found it especially useful. I did want to leave you with a few takeaways that really stuck with me from the episode and thought might be worth reflecting for you as you continue into your week. The first one is that avoiding hard conversations has a cost of their own. And he said it well when he said silence is expensive. And from my personal experience, I definitely agree. The longer I've avoided a conversation, the more the trust is eroded and the more that the damage compounds. A former Netflix executive, and y'all know that I like to study Netflix and their culture, Patty McCord was her name. And she said that the real speed at Netflix didn't just come from their technology enablement, but from being able to talk about things early, directly, and often and comfortably. And I've seen it too. Teams with all the right tools, but not the right culture tend to stall. And teams with far fewer resources somehow thrive because they know how to talk and what to talk about. The second one is around psychological safety and how it's not really a perk, but it's a prerequisite if you want sustainable innovation. It's not the same as being nice. It's about being kind, honest, and feeling safe to fail, and knowing that your voice matters on that team. You've probably heard of the study that came from Google's Project Aristotle that found that psychological safety was the #1 predictor of team success at Google. And I've personally been on both sides. Early on, I used to avoid speaking up. And later, I created environments where others were afraid to speak up. And in both cases, we lost out on the instincts and the intelligence of this really smart team that we put a lot of effort into pulling together. And it wasn't until I started modeling vulnerability myself that we unlocked better ideas as a team and made clearer decisions. And I stopped being the bottleneck around a lot of these creative decisions too. Something that helped me was realizing that you can't be everything to everyone. You can foster a certain level of safety, I think, on your team, and then build a team that can thrive within that. This does unfortunately mean sometimes parting ways with folks who either don't foster that safety and don't help you on that mission, or the ones, unfortunately, that need more than you can realistically provide. And I think that clarity helps protect the balance of the team, and as a leader, helps you stop negotiating with yourself. The third one is around rituals and how they can create predictability in chaos, especially when they're intentional and not dogmatic. The guest reminded us that rituals are tools, not dogma. And take Amazon's 6-pager, for example. It works because people know the format, the expectations, and how to engage. This is something that we really loved at Integral, and we introduced a similar pre-read document. And this was later on in our maturity, and I'd learned a few things along the way. So I didn't prescribe it myself. I asked the leaders to define the problem, propose the process, and iterate directly with the team. And I would fall in line with the process themselves. And I think that's the key to co-creating. And you make sure that people know why they exist and how we know if it's working still. In our case, the document or pre-read addressed a few things. We found that meeting owners sometimes lacked clarity themselves. We found that attendees came in without shared context. And then extroverts, like myself, took up too much of the airtime. This process ended up really helping us where we contributed asynchronously, we challenged assumptions, and we raised the quality of our decisions, and the team owned this. I didn't have to do it myself, and it wasn't another Ashok thing. The fourth takeaway that I really liked from the episode is that leaders like you must know how and when to mediate conflict. Joshua gave us a very simple and powerful tip that I hadn't thought of myself. Avoid asking why questions, which can trigger defensiveness, and instead ask what or how questions to keep things logical, grounded, and constructive. Now, I'll concede, I used to hate stepping into team conflict and would want them to figure it out themselves. But I've learned that those moments reveal the most about the product, the team, our values, and that conflict carried a lot of context for me. Mediation isn't about control. It's about helping the team move forward in a way that reflects who you are as a company and an organization. The fifth one that I had to learn the hard way myself is to check in with yourself before reacting. There's a Nobel Prize winner, Daniel Kahneman, and an author that you may have heard of. And he says, nothing in life is as important as you think it is while you're thinking about it. To pause, to breathe, to ask yourself if you're reacting from stress or fear. And that can really change the quality of your decision-making. Something that's helped me personally a lot is breath work. And it's something that top performers in many fields tend to talk about, I find. And it's not just in hard conversations, it's in also when I'm experiencing a creative rut. Even in sports, when I'm not really performing as well as I typically do, finding my breathing tends to help me find my game. And at Integral, we'd even start some tough conversations with 10 deep breaths or 2 minutes of breath work. It felt a little kooky at first. And I was really glad when some of the folks who attended those meetings came back and said that it was really helpful and started to introduce it in their own sessions as a ritual, and then it propagated from there. There's something that Joshua said that I wanted to end with here, which is that you can't do it perfectly. You can just do the best you can with the information you have and the skills you've got at the time. And I think that's a really powerful reminder to any of us in leadership, because it is easy to get overwhelmed and not get started, especially when the stakes feel high and the clarity feels low. So I've said this before, and I tell myself this often: start small, start now, and start with yourself. If this episode resonated, please consider hitting that subscribe button or leaving us a review and giving us a 5-star rating. It really helps new listeners who are really curious about building better teams and better products find the show. And it helps us keep conversations like this going. We will be back next week, as we always are, with another conversation about fostering engaged teams who build delightful products. We'll see you then, folks. Thank you for joining me on the Convergence Podcast today. Subscribe to the Convergence Podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you get your content. If you're listening and found this helpful, please give us a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, hit that like button and tell me what you think about what you heard today.